What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Maryland Terrapins are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Maryland did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Maryland. My projection for this team was 6-6, and then my prediction for them, I had them going 7-5. So I was kind of expecting Maryland to be a decent team and a quality team out of the Big Ten and definitely make it to a bowl game, because usually this is one of the more consistent programs in the Big Ten where they make it to a bowl game every year, and they're just well coached. But it was kind of a disappointing year last year for the Terrapins, and I think mainly because of that, they went 4-8 last year and not make it to a bowl game is because of the expansion of the Big Ten, and they also had a pretty tough schedule as well in 2024. You look at that schedule from last year, especially in the Big Ten, but first off in the non-conference, they played UConn on the road at Virginia out of the ACC, and then they played Villanova, so not a tough non-conference schedule. They ended up winning all their non-conference games, but you look at the Big Ten schedule. At home last year, they played Michigan State, Northwestern, USC, and then they also played Rutgers and Iowa. So they had a pretty favorable home schedule, but they almost lost every single game at home. They beat USC. That was a big win there, but USC was kind of also a disappointing team. But yeah, Maryland, because of this expansion in the Big Ten, I think really created a disappointing season for them. They had a very tough road schedule, though. You look at who they played on the road last year. They played Indiana, Minnesota, Oregon, and Penn State. So yeah, that's a very brutal road schedule there. Of course, Indiana was a big surprise team. Minnesota was a pretty decent team. And then Oregon and Penn State were just the two teams that went to the Big Ten championship last year. So yeah, a tough schedule here for Maryland in 2024. Does it get much better for them in 2025? Well, here is a schedule for them coming up in 2025. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Maryland plays in the non-conference this season. So you look at their non-conference schedule, they will play Florida Atlantic, Northern Illinois, and then Townsend. So you got an FCS team in Townsend, then you got a couple of Group of 5 teams. You got Florida Atlantic out of the American Conference. You know, they were not great last year, so maybe Maryland's kind of big favorites against the Owls. But Northern Illinois, that's not going to be an easy game. Northern Illinois was the team that beat Notre Dame last year in a non-conference game. So there's a possibility that the Terrapins could lose that game, but you couldn't really ask for an easier non-conference schedule compared to last year for Maryland. Yeah, last year was a pretty easy schedule, but they don't have to play like a Power 4 opponent for that matter. So yeah, that's your non-conference schedule. Let's take a look at their home games in the Big Ten. They will play Washington, Nebraska, Indiana, and Michigan all at home in the Big Ten this year. So this is a pretty favorable home schedule for Maryland. You know, Washington, a pretty winnable game. Nebraska could be a winnable game. Indiana and Michigan are going to be tough, but you know, they can beat Indiana. Obviously, Indiana, we don't know if they're going to be as good as they were last year, but you know, Kirk Zanetti knows how to get it done. He's got some transfers coming in, and Michigan possibly could be a top 25 team. So that might be the toughest game at home for Maryland. I know Indiana was really good last year, but you know, Michigan, they are definitely going to be the toughest home game in my opinion for the Terrapins, but they do have a pretty good shot here to pull off an upset. Let's now go to the away schedule for Maryland. They'll play on the road at Wisconsin, at UCLA, at Rutgers, and then at Illinois. So those are their true road games. And then you got Michigan State here, which is not an away game, but it's on a neutral field. They played that one in Detroit, and I talked about this one for Michigan State. It's not even an away game for them either. It's a neutral site game. It's going to be held at Detroit, but it's basically kind of like a home game for Michigan State because they're much closer, but I still think either way both fan bases will show up, but yeah, they're true road games. They play 4 true road games in the Big Ten. You know, Illinois is going to be a pretty tough one because Illinois definitely is a tough place to play, and they do have a lot of production coming back. Rutgers, a pretty decent team, but Wisconsin and UCLA, they can absolutely win those games on the road, so those are winnable games there for Maryland. So yeah, not a tough road schedule either for Maryland. Let's go back to the schedule now and go full game by game now for the Terrapins. They will start things off with Florida Florida Atlantic on August 30th, and then they get Northern Illinois at home on September 6th, and then they play Townsend on September 13th. So they play all three of their non-conference games in the first 3 weeks. They got 3 straight home games to kick off the season, and then they jump right into Big Ten play on September 20th on the road at Wisconsin, and then they get a bye week before playing Washington at home on October 4th. Not a really bad spot for a bye week. You get to play 4 games, and then you kind of get that break before going into the rest of Big Ten play. But yeah, they'll play Washington coming out of the bye week on October 4th, and then they play Nebraska also at home on October the 11th. So they have back-to-back home games there in the month of October against Washington and Nebraska. And then they go on the road to play UCLA on October 18th, and then they get another bye week. And this is not really an ideal spot for a bye week because it does come in the last weekend of the month of October. So they actually have 2 bye weeks before going into the month of October. But yeah, they come out of the bye week. They'll play Indiana, but that's a pretty good spot for a bye week, getting ready for a big game against Indiana on November 1st. And then they play Rutgers on the road on November 8th. Then also they'll play on the road at Illinois on November 15th. So you got back-to-back road games there with Rutgers and Illinois. And then you come back at home to play Michigan on November 22nd. And then they close things out at Detroit on a neutral field against Michigan State on November 29th. So this schedule, it's not all that tough for Maryland. Just looking at it, you don't have to play Oregon like you did last year. Same thing with Penn State. You do got to play Michigan and Illinois. Those are probably going to be the 2 toughest games on this schedule for Maryland, but they also don't have to play Ohio State, which is also good news. And they also don't have to, they just don't have to play those 3 top teams in the Big Ten this year. So I like the way this schedule sets up. They got back-to-back home games there with Washington and Nebraska, but they got back-to-back road games there with Rutgers and Illinois. Yeah, that's going to be pretty tough, but they can probably win those 2 games. I know Illinois was pretty good last year, and they might be good again, but these are absolutely games on this schedule, except maybe Michigan and Indiana are going to be the toughest home games, but they can absolutely win every game on this schedule. But let's now get a projection based on how tough this schedule is for Maryland. This is the scale I'll be using here for their official projection. If it's basically a 1% game in the red, that's going to be pretty much your automatic loss. And then your 20% in the orange, that's where Maryland's going to be like a double-digit underdog, so about 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that point range. 40% in the yellow, that's where they'll be a clear underdog by 6 or 7 points, so less than a touchdown, somewhere in that percentage. And then your 50-50 games, those will stay in the white. Games that really can go either way. 60% in the purple, they'll be favored by less than a touchdown, so we're talking about 6 or 7 points. And then 80% in the blue, they'll be favored by double digits there, so 10 to 14 points. And then 99% in the green, that's pretty much your automatic win. So we'll start with those easy wins for Maryland. I think you got a couple of those, Florida Atlantic and Townsend. Florida Atlantic is not a bad team out of the group of 5 in the American, but they were not great last year, so I think Maryland will be a big favorite here in this one. They'll be favored by at least like 17 or 20 plus. Now, I think they'll be favored against Townsend, pretty big, but, Florida Atlantic, that could be somewhat of a, tricky game there. But, yeah, Maryland, I think, will still be favored by like 17 or 20 plus. So, those are your 2 easy wins for Maryland. And then I'm going to put the Northern Illinois game here in the blue for right now, because Northern Illinois is a team that is a decent group of 5 team out of the MAC, and they were actually the team that upset Notre Dame last year in week 2, if you don't remember that. So yeah, I think this could be a tough game here for Maryland. I'm not saying they're going to lose. They'll still be favored because they are the better team and everything, and the more talented team, but you never know. These group of 5 teams can pull off upsets any day of the week. So yeah, Maryland, I think, will be just a double-digit favorite here. So we're talking about 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. So yeah, a couple of touchdowns somewhere in that range. And then you look at the rest of the schedule, it's all Big Ten opponents. I can't really favor Maryland in any of these Big Ten games by less than a touchdown, so we're talking about 6 or 7 points. So let's jump into the games now where Maryland is going to be an underdog. I don't have any games in the red, but I do have one game here in the orange, and that's on the road at Illinois. This is a very tough game on the road, and Illinois was pretty good last year, so I wouldn't be surprised if Maryland is probably a double-digit underdog in this game. But yeah, Illinois, I think they're just going to be pretty good. That's a team that has got a lot of production coming back-to-back. And, playing on the road, that's going to be a pretty tricky one there for Maryland. So that's the reason why you're seeing that game in the orange instead of the yellow. So yeah, they'll be double-digit underdogs against Illinois. So we're talking about 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular point range. And then I got a few games here in the yellow, 2 games I should say. You got Indiana and Michigan, and this is where I think Maryland's going to be a 6 or 7 point underdog. These are 2 big games at home here for the Terrapins. They can absolutely pull off one of these 2 games in an upset here. Indiana could possibly be like a top 25 team, same thing with Michigan. So we're talking about a couple games that Maryland will have top 25 matchups here in the month of November, and usually we do see a lot of upsets here in this month and everything. It does get crazy when it gets into the month of November. So yeah, Indiana, Michigan, I think Maryland will be 6 or 7 point underdogs in both of those games. They'll be less than a touchdown, which means it's not because they will be an underdog and lose. These are 2 games that they can absolutely win, and they could pull off the upset. So yeah, those 2 games, Maryland will be a clear underdog in both of them by 6 or 7 points. And then that's going to leave you with 6 total 50-50 games. You got Wisconsin, Washington, Nebraska, UCLA, and then Rutgers and Michigan State. So Wisconsin, that's a pretty even matchup. We'll see if they can turn things around. Washington, because it's at home, that's the reason why it does turn into a 50-50 game. Same thing with Nebraska. UCLA and Rutgers, UCLA is a pretty even matchup in my opinion. And then Rutgers, I was really close to favoring the Scarlet Knights here by 6 or 7 points, but I'm going to put it as a 50-50 game for right now because that's just a tough game to call as of right now here on November the 8th. And then Michigan State, because it's on a neutral field, that's the reason why it does turn out to a 50-50 game. So let's now get a projected record here for Maryland based on how tough their schedule is. We count the 2 green games as wins, and then you count the blue game against Northern Illinois also as a win, but you count the Illinois game as a loss there on the road on November 15th. Average out the 2 games at 40% in the yellow at 40%, and then you average out all the 6 of these 50-50 games at 50%. And odds would say they're probably going to split these 50-50 games. Let's say they win 3 out of the 6 here, and they probably, beat Wisconsin, Washington, and Nebraska, and then probably lose to UCLA, Rutgers, and Michigan State. And then you got your 3 more wins here with Florida Atlantic, Northern Illinois, and Townsend. Yeah, that's going to give you to a bowl game. So 6-6 is the projection here for Maryland. So same projection as last year from 2024 to this year for 2025. Again, I like the way this schedule sets up. Again, they got back-to-back road games there with Rutgers and Illinois, but they got a schedule that sets up pretty well, and it's not a tough schedule at all. They got a pretty easy non-conference schedule. Again, Northern Illinois will be tough, but they got a pretty easy non-conference schedule nonetheless, and they don't have to play Ohio State, they don't have to play Oregon or Penn State, so you avoid those 3 teams, and then you got winnable games against Indiana and Michigan where you're going to be 6 or 7 point underdogs, so they do have a chance to have a pretty successful year and definitely have a turnaround of a season. Now, they probably won't be a Big Ten top contender or a dark horse for that matter, but as long as they make it to a bowl game, that's definitely going to be a good sign for Maryland to really turn things around. But yeah, 6-6, I think best case scenario is probably 7-5. Worst case, probably like 5-7. If they go 5-7 or 4-8 again, then that's probably going to be another disappointing year for Maryland. But based on how tough this schedule is, the projection does come out to 6-6 here for 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know your thoughts about this Maryland team down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.